Were you taught in school that there are certain grammatical rules that can never be broken? Were you taught that you should never use slang, that there is only one form of correct English? Well, if you were, you must have had some very trying times trying to talk to people. Now, in just a moment, we're going to show you what rules really are, who makes them and why, and how all this affects our ability to speak a foreign language. In our last program, we completed our definition of language. And you may remember, it went like this. Language is a learned, arbitrary system of vocal symbols through which human beings interact in terms of their total culture. And we had paused on this term learned. And we had shown you that we didn't know very much about how children learned language, but one thing we did know, that they did learn it early and thoroughly and completely outside of their awareness. That is, they learned the system. That is the most important thing. The patterns, the arrangements, all of these things the child learned early and thoroughly, and again, completely outside of his awareness. Well, now we want to direct our attention to how do we learn a language when we're grown-up people, when we're adults. And I know that I've heard a sentence that you've probably heard hundreds of times, too. Everybody knows the only way, or the best way, to learn a foreign language is to go to the country where it's spoken and get yourself a native teacher. Now, obviously, the first part of this statement, nobody would question at all. If you really want to learn a foreign language, sure. Go to the country where it's spoken. You've got plenty of chance to practice it. You can actually hear it around you all the time. But it's this business about the native teacher that interests me. Get yourself a native teacher. Now, the point is this. Unless the native teacher has had special linguistic training, he will be really of no more help to you in learning a foreign language than any other native speaker. The native speaker and native speakers, these are really important if you're going to learn how the language really works, how it sounds, how it operates. But the native teacher, unless he knows linguistics, is going to be confused between language and writing just the way every other educated person is. And we already talked in the second show about the fact that language was not writing, that writing was incomplete and inconsistent. But the native teacher, he's going to tell you all kinds of things, and he cannot know any more about the structure of his language without special training than any other native speaker. This was really brought home to me some years ago. In fact, it was in 1948, 2 weeks after the election in which President Truman surprised everybody by being reelected. I was at a dinner party in Washington. It was given for some members of the French mission there, and one of the guests was a very bright and perceptive young Frenchman, about 30, who was fascinated about everything about the United States of America. In fact, he knew more facts about the United States of America than any man I've ever known. Well, after dinner that night, he and our host were looking over the back pages, the pages of a back number of Life magazine. It was about 2 weeks old. In fact, it had come out 2 weeks before the election. And they came to a picture of Governor Dewey and Governor Warren posed against a white fence. In the background was a white farmhouse, white barn, white silo, and so on. And they looked at the picture, and the American turned to the Frenchman. He said, "I guess Tom Dewey found out that every White House isn't a White House, didn't he?" The Frenchman looked very blank. So the American raised his voice. You know, you always do. That's supposed to make the foreigner understand somehow or other. So he said, "I guess Tom Dewey found out that every White House isn't the White House, didn't he?" The Frenchman still looked puzzled. He said, "Every White House is not the White House? I do not hear the différence. What do you mean?" So the American said, "Well, you see, it's like this. You see, we have a presidential palace. Well, really, I should call it a presidential mansion. You see, it's owned by the taxpayers, and it's..." Well, the Frenchman, who probably knew the name of the man that laid the first brick of the foundation, said, "Please, my friend," he said, "all this I know. But what you have said, I can translate perfectly in French, word for word. Chaque maison blanche n'est pas la maison blanche. But in French, he said, it is what we call an aphorism. You say a cute remark. But in English, I can tell by your face it is a joke. Why is it a joke?" The American tried to explain it to him. It was really awful. I didn't want to see a beautiful friendship broken up, so I stepped in and I explained to both of them what was involved. The Frenchman understood immediately, the American hasn't understood to this day. Well, come here. Let's see what is involved. Here's our sentence. Every White House is in the White House. And here is the French. As the Frenchman said, it seems to be translated word for word. Chaque maison blanche n'est pas la maison blanche. Chaque, every, maison, house, white, blanche, isn't, n'est pas, the, la, White House, maison blanche again. But of course it is not being translated word for word because, as the Frenchman noted, this was a joke in English. What kind of a joke do we call this kind of a joke? Well, we call it a pun, a play on words, obviously. Now, the Frenchman didn't hear what makes this thing a pun in English. I'm going to tell you what the pun is on, if you will, but I'm going to have to do something to really explain it to you first. The pun is on what we call the stress system of English, the business of saying words louder, one word louder than another. Now, in order to show you about the stress and how this thing is a pun, which I'll return to later, I have to show you something about the English stress system. Our problem is, how many stresses are there? Well, in the first place, what is a stress? A stress is this business of the degree of significant loudness that is in the system of the language that the native speaker reacts to. Miss Fittich, your old school teacher, told you there were 2 degrees of stress, the accented syllable and the unaccented syllable. Even our best dictionaries give us only 3 degrees of stress. Let's see how many there really are. Here on the blackboard, I have 3 words, the same 3 words, light and house and keeper, 3 different times. And I'm going to show you that by changing the stresses on these words, the degrees of loudness that we say them, we're going to say 3 different things. Things are going to mean 3 different things. The first one I'm going to do is lighthouse keeper, a person who keeps a lighthouse, lighthouse keeper. Now listen, you'll agree that the loudest degree of stress is on the first word. The second loudest degree of stress is on the syllable keep. The weakest is on the and house is said stronger than but not so strong as keep. Listen again. Lighthouse keeper. Lighthouse keeper. All right, now, I'm going to say it another way. Lighthouse keeper. Now, what's a lighthouse keeper? A lighthouse keeper is a person that does light housekeeping, whatever that entails. Primary stress now is on the house. I'm getting ahead of myself for just a minute. Let me name these degrees of stress for you. These 4 stresses are the ones that we have in English. This is the answer to our question. And they are primary, secondary, tertiary, and weak. These are the labels I want to give them. You can call them A, B, C, D if you want. Number them 1, 2, 3, 4. I don't care. Just as long as we all agree we are talking about 4 significant degrees of loudness in the system of English. So in our second example then, light housekeeper, the primary stress, the loudest stress, is on house. This syllable now is reduced to tertiary. This is still weak. And I set it with tertiary stress again on light. Now listen, light housekeeper. All right, now, for the number 3, I am going to put the same stresses on housekeeper as I did in number 2. But I'm now going to put secondary stress on the light. Listen to it now. She's a light housekeeper. Now, what's the difference between a light housekeeper and a light housekeeper? Well, if you listen, a light housekeeper is a housekeeper that doesn't weigh very much, right? In other words, 3 different things said 3 different ways. Light housekeeper, light housekeeper, light housekeeper. Well, you might say, gosh, I'll never hear those differences. I'll tell you one thing. You learn to distinguish these 4 degrees of stress when you're about 2.5, if you're physiologically normal. Okay, let's get another series of examples. New Yorker. Everybody knows what a New Yorker is. If I put tertiary stress and primary stress on it, this is obviously a person who lives in New York, or a car by Mr. Chrysler, or a magazine by that name. But a New Yorker with secondary stress on the new and primary on the York, that's not a person that lives in New York. That's a new arrival in York, Pennsylvania, or York, England, right? New Yorker, New Yorker. Every New Yorker is certainly not a New Yorker. You'll notice that these adjectives get said over and over again on secondary stress, whereas the compounds take tertiary stress. Another example right here. Long Island. Tertiary stress, this again makes a compound. This talks about that part of New York State we call Long Island, sure. But a Long Island with secondary stress on it, this refers now to a body of land entirely surrounded by water, which is this way rather than that way. It's all done without the aid of mirrors. However, if I should reverse these stresses, I get no sense at all. First, I'll say the thing right. Long Island is a Long Island, right? Now I'll reverse them. Long Island is a Long Island. Makes no sense at all, obviously. Now we can return to our sentence with the Frenchman. And here you see it. Every white house isn't the White House. Here is the secondary stress on the white, signifying the adjective, and here the primary and the tertiary makes this a compound. In other words, what makes this a pun in English is the fact that English has 4 degrees of stress, and we have to change them around depending upon the patterns in which these words reside, which we find these words. But in French, stress is not significant on the word level, and consequently, since in French, automatically you will have a louder stress on the last word of each intonation pattern, he can't hear what's happening here at all. Where we say every white house isn't the White House and make a play on words, he says chaque maison blanche n'est pas la maison blanche. That's the way he says it in French, so he hears it that way in English. Every White House is not the White House, and he does not get the pun. Now, of course, if you are not aware of your stress system, you would never be able to make that plain. Never be able to make that plain to the speaker of a foreign language. And this is something that is not in the writing system, something we have to learn through special linguistic knowledge. So there's the problem with the Frenchman. Now, how about German? German actually has a stress system extremely similar to English. It has the same 4 degrees of stress, primary, secondary, tertiary, and weak. It actually makes compounds out of primaries and tertiaries, very much like English does, for 50% of the time. The other 50% of the time, the German, being, of course, a perverse fella, by our terms, turns it around just backwards. Look, here's English. White House, primary and tertiary, the one we had over there. German has a similar pattern, primary and tertiary. Bahnhof, railroad station. So far, so good. German also has another pattern, like our lighthouse keeper pattern up here, with primary and secondary. Sturmbannführer, exactly the same as lighthouse keeper in terms of its degrees of stress. But here's where the joker resides. Where we put our adjectives, if you will, under secondary stress, as in New Yorker, Long Island, light housekeeper, the German puts the adjectives under tertiary stress and makes a compound out of those with secondary. Look. Here's a sentence. The New Yorker is a new magazine. English. Tertiary and primary makes this a compound, is a new magazine. Secondary here signals the adjective. But what does the German say? Neue, incidentally, means new in German, and Zeitung means newspaper or Times, like New York Times, you see. Die neue Zeitung ist eine neue Zeitung. He puts secondary stress to make the compound and tertiary stress to make the adjective. Just exactly the opposite. Now, if the speaker of English projects his stresses on German, he comes out with Die neue Zeitung ist eine neue Zeitung. And the German gets a visceral twitch. This is not German. He must have meant to say it the other way. It makes no more sense than saying Long Island is a Long Island. So we have got to be sure when we're speaking German that we know in our awareness what our stress system is and how it's the same and how it differs from German. But the poor Frenchman, of course, has to learn the whole concept of stress in order to handle either one of the languages. Now, by the same token, the American had better be awful careful when he's learning French not to project, or the German, not to project their 4 stresses on French. You know, something like this, la pipe de la bouche de papa. Oh, the Frenchman ducks and says, why do you talk so strong? The American says, what should I say? And the Frenchman says, well, you see, French is the most beautiful, the most mellifluous, the most logical language in the world. We say, la pipe de la bouche de papa. And the American says, that's what I said, la pipe de la bouche de papa. The Frenchman throws up his hands and arms and says, les Américains, they have no soul. Well, of course, the soul has nothing whatsoever to do with it. If we were told when we started off learning French about our stress system and how French didn't have it, then we would not project it on the French. Now, our native teacher. Our native teacher has, so to speak, already 2 strikes against it. In the first place, he does not know that language is not writing. That's one thing. And the second thing, he is completely confused about the structure of his own language, particularly that part which is not reflected in the writing system. In other words, he is trying to do a job about the structure of the language through a medium which doesn't give him any indication of it. He, like us, learned these kinds of things long ago, outside of awareness, very thoroughly, but cannot make systematic statements about them without special linguistic knowledge. Now, he has another strike against him, the poor native teacher, whom we have been taught to rely on so heavily. And that is, he is confused between 2 levels. He is confused between the standard conversational or colloquial speech of educated people and the literary language. In other words, he has been so trained that writing is language. He's also been trained that literature, that most important part of language, the permanent part, is the only important part of language. Consequently, he tries to teach us when we want to learn to speak the language like a native, actually how people have to write the language. He wants to teach us, so to speak, to talk like books, to speak better French, Swahili, German, or what have you, than he does himself. Now, nothing could be farther from the truth. Nothing could be more stultifying or make it more difficult for you to cooperate or interact with other people than to go around talking like a book. I can remember in the last war when I was working with German prisoners. We were training for military government posts. And they had to write compositions, those that knew English pretty well, and some of them did. We made them write the same composition over and over again. What I do with my day, there wasn't very much we had to give and write compositions about, and they always would start off the same way. At 6:30, I arose and commenced my duties, whereupon they told you the very same similar kind of day, since they were all behind barbed wire. And then at 10:30, after doing my English homework, I retired. They always arose and retired. And I said, look, gentlemen, in this country, we get up in the morning and we go to bed at night. And they said, but please, Major, isn't that colloquial? And I said, yes, colloquial means conversational. They're two different levels. If people should ever tell you, and you know how many times you've heard it, maybe said it yourself, you know, this business of these foreigners, the Hungarian or the French, they really speak better English than we do. If you ever hear that said to you, go home and wash your mouth out with soap because you have been sold down the river by some well-meaning native teacher who has made you talk like a book, who has tried to make you use words in conversation that you would never use, that no native speaker would ever use. So this matter, when I'm talking this way, am I saying, in effect, that the linguist doesn't have any standards, that everything goes, that anything is just as good as anything else? No, I'm not. I'm not at all. Obviously, the linguist is well aware that there are all kinds of levels of difference. And he is well aware that there are certain people who talk in a certain way, and those people who talk in that particular way come in the back door rather than the front door. And obviously, when you are trying to teach a person to use a foreign language, you will teach him that particular form which will get him in the front door and not make him come in the back door, of course. What is this business, then, of correctness? In the first place, the native teacher, as we've already seen, believes that you have to go to the literary language and abide by grammatical rules, failing to realize that grammatical rules are not something you have to learn before you can talk, but really are statements of how the language really operates. And because the grammatical rules have been erected to make people write the literary language correctly, you could see how the whole thing gets bollocksed up. I can remember, and this isn't just the native teacher trying to teach somebody a second language, it's the native teacher teaching native speakers. In other words, when I was in school in the 4th grade, I remember we had a dear, dedicated, young woman by the name of Miss Fittich, obviously not her name. And she was, oh boy, she was giving us a real treatment one morning about how we had to say, it is I, that it was wrong to say, it's me. And she was giving this long business. She got way over the other end of the blackboard, so she was way down in this corner of the room. And my name being Smith, we were arranged alphabetically. My desk was way back yonder in the corner, and I heard the tiptoeing footsteps of our principal, who was known to faculty and students alike as Pussyfoot Arbuthnot, obviously not his name. So as Pussyfoot Arbuthnot came tiptoeing down the hall, he got to the door of our classroom and whammo, opened the door, but because Miss Fittich was way up yonder, he couldn't see her. So he said, who's in here teaching this class? And she said, it's me, Mr. Arbuthnot, Miss Fittich. I never will forget that if I live to be 150 years old. Miss Fittich, our old school teacher, talked just the way we talked when the chips were down. Well, I could tell you that if we only realized the difference between levels, we'd be much better off. What is correctness, then? What is the best English? The best English, the best Swahili, the best German, the best anything, the linguist would say is that form which gets the maximum amount of cooperation in the maximum number of speech situations. That's the best. Now, any form, then, as a corollary to this, that attracts attention to itself in the situation in which it's being used is a bad form for that situation. This was never more beautifully brought home to me than in the last war, again, when I used to lecture pretty regularly to a group of Army officers that had taken over a college up in the Valley of Virginia, actually. And I was always late in the morning. This lecture was given at an ungodly hour. And I always tried to get some breakfast, however, before I went up there. And I stopped at a combination bus terminal, a general store, and the restaurant effect. And I got there one morning, late as usual, and I said to the man behind the counter, "I'd like a glass of tomato juice, please." He said, "What'd you say?" I said, "I'd like a glass of tomato juice, please." He said, "That's what I thought you said, just a minute." Whistled through his teeth like that, called, gestured in the back room. Man came in, wiping his hands on his apron. He said, "Now, would you tell me what you wanted again?" I said, "I'd like a glass of tomato juice, please." The man that had come in from the kitchen said, "Doggone, I never would have believed it," reached in his pocket, handed the other man a quarter, and left. The man returned to me. He said, "What can I do for you?" I said, "I want a glass of tomato juice, please." "Coming right up," he said. Well, in my dialect area, tomato happens to be the preferred form. However, in most of the United States, tomato is the first form, and hence tomato is the form that you will find in the dictionary as number one. Tomato is also used, just a statistical matter. The point is that a form that would be, in my particular dialect area, essential for me to get cooperation is not going to get me the same kind of cooperation all the rest of the country. This is a relative matter. So therefore, don't get into arguments with your friends or have bets as to which is the correct form. Between tomato and tomato, it's a toss-up, and the only way you could decide it is on number of speakers. Therefore, to sum up what we've been talking about, grammar is a statement of the structure of how the language works. The linguist has to listen and record forms like them things just as much as he records forms like those things, though he knows forms like them things are associated with people who are not very highly prized in the culture, or not as highly prized or as educated as those who say those things. The linguist has to record everything, but the linguist then correlates that with other things in the culture to find out what the more acceptable usage is. Grammar is structure, and the colloquial language is prior to the written language or the literary language, and these two must be separated, or you're not going to be able to teach a person a good usage, a normal, acceptable usage of a foreign language. Now, there's another facet to this business of correctness, which I think we've heard over and over again. And that is this business of people very, very much concerned that the language isn't what it used to be. It's now decaying. It gets corrupted through use. I have here a sentence which I actually pulled out of a modern college grammar book just last week. And the sentence goes as follows. Within 1 or 2 generations, our ancient heritage of English may very well become a jargon of slang and illiteracy. I don't see how there could be more words put down on paper that could be more wrong than that. If the only thing we had to worry about was the fact that our language was going to degenerate to a jargon of slang and illiteracy in 1 or 2 generations, we could really consider ourselves carefree. Now, anybody knows that things that used to be considered slang and absolutely impossible, like mob, perfectly acceptable word today. What else can you call a group of people that are going slightly crazy? That word was considered the worst word you could use in the 18th century. In other words, one generation slang or considered bad usage becomes perfectly acceptable the next generation. Why? Because language changes. Nothing can stop language change. Nothing can stop the change in any part of culture. It is true, language is conservative and changes less fast in other parts of a culture, and when you write the language, you're putting an extra brake on it. However, listen. Ochtere sada his hlavorde Alfred de Kuninga, that he ealera Northmas Buddha. Did you catch maybe one word of that here and there, something that sounded familiar to you? Well, this is English, yes. English as spoken by King Alfred around 891, late 9th century. Here it is. Ochtere sada his hlavorde Alfred de Kuninga, that he ealera Northmas Buddha. Ochtere said to his lord, notice the dative, hlavorde Alfred Kuninga, the king, that he ealera Northman, of all the Northmen, Northmas Buddha, lived the northmost. This verb has gone out of the language entirely, and we don't put our verb at the end. We've lost the dative and the genitive plural, which is the kind of thing that you have in Latin and so on. All that gone. Language doesn't sound very much like that today either, does it? All right, now listen to this. Hwanger April with his sure sota, the drucht of Marche, verse to the rota, and bathed every vein in switch liqueur, of which virtue engendered is the fluor. The opening lines of Chaucer's prologue to the Canterbury Tale. I don't think the language ever sounded prettier than it did then. That's really nice. Now here it looks a little bit more familiar. That is spelled T-H-A-T. We could recognize April here, March, and so on. Reason for that is that William Caxton published the first book in English in 1472 or 75, I've forgotten the exact date, but he used Chaucer's Canterbury Tale. That was the first book printed in English, and that particular thing was printed just the way Chaucer wrote it. And because of that fact, we still spell our language very much the way Geoffrey Chaucer did, and he was gathered to his fathers in 1400. Now, listen to this. To be or not to be, aye, that is the question. Whether it is noble in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against the say of troubles than by opposing end them, to die, to sleep. This is safely modern English. And I don't say that Shakespeare sounded like that, but I will say that certain people during the time he lived would have said those lines very much that way. Now, of course, we know that the King James Version of the Bible, you know, in the English of this period, which is 1600 about, is a little hard for us to get onto. It's got those thou didst and things of that kind and various words not used the way they are today. But this is safely modern English, even though it does sound a little strange and at times have a few strange forms in it. But it's still our language, and it represents the changing that has gone on and on and on. In other words, language is constantly going to change no matter what we do about it. There's nothing we can do about it, and it is not being corrupted. It is just changing. Then this business of what is a dead language. Do languages die? No, languages don't die. People do. A whole group of people may stop speaking a language and speak another language. The important thing here, I think, to remember is this, that when a language has ceased to change, it is a dead language. However, many languages that we call dead languages are simply earlier forms of a language that we happen to still find spoken today. Here is, of course, a copy, the Rosetta Stone. This is written in hieroglyphs. This is written in characters. This is the Coptic language. And this is Greek, the kind of Greek that was spoken at this particular time. We call Greek a dead language. Is it dead? No. Greek is still spoken by speakers of modern Greek. This form is dead, just as Alfred's form of English is dead, if you will. Okay? You see how it goes. In other words, Latin isn't dead, just Cicero's form. Latin is still spoken by speakers of French, Italian, Spanish, the Romance languages. Languages don't die. People do. But a language that has really ceased to change, that is a dead language. Now, to summarize everything we've said today, actually our most important point is to realize that grammar and correctness is really something that comes after the fact of usage. That is the system of the language. That is the important thing. And that the written language, literary language, is of a different level, has different kinds of things that one has to do to be able to handle it properly, because it's on a different level, and it has to be put down in a writing system that's incomplete and inconsistent. Standards there are, but those standards are not generally the kind that we've been taught in school, where the whole thing has been reversed. Now, next week, we are going to be talking about the smallest sounds we make in language. Be with us then, won't you?
This is National Educational Television.